Hello, and welcome to the Dreaming and Doing podcast. I am here today with Dr. Ann Welsh, who's a distinguished psychologist and executive coach with an affinity for supporting women in leadership and aiding working parents across diverse career landscapes. And beginning her career at Harvard, she has since pivoted, dedicating her life to unraveling the interplay between career aspirations, personal fulfillment, and women's mental health throughout the lifespan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course, I'm so excited to be here.
I have a lot of questions for you. So you wear these two hats. I mean, you probably wear more than these two, but these are the two that I'm going to talk about.
Yeah.
You wear the hat as a therapist and also as a coach. Talk with me about some of the most common concerns you hear from working people in therapy and in coaching.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting, right, is even though I do wear these two hats, a lot of the concerns overlap and maybe the approach is a little bit different. But I think there are a couple big ones that people come with. And one is some sense of overwhelm, right? And I find that a lot of times it's maybe people who are used to being high achievers and maybe they're used to being able to get everything done. And at some point, they start to feel like they can't. And whether that's because they've added a family and that's made it feel hard, or they've moved into a leadership role and they're trying to still do all of the individual contributor stuff and struggling with adding the layer of management, but that sense of I can't keep up anymore. I kind of feel like I'm drowning is often what brings people in.
Yes.
And relatedly is a sense of failing, like I'm failing at something, at some piece.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be like perfectionism showing up. It could be an actual failure, right, where there's a skill deficit, whether that's interpersonal skills or, something that they're really struggling with. But these are the two big things that tend to bring people in. And I would say the other kind of common buckets would be feeling alone and feeling really unsupported in some way.
Yes.
Again, whether that's at home or at work, or generally feeling unhappy, feeling like I got this promotion and I thought it would be the thing that makes me happy and I'm not. And so now what do I do? Or I had these kids and I thought that would be the thing that would make me happy and I'm not. And what's going on? Why isn't it enough?
Yes, I love all of those. Those are things that we've talked about here on the podcast before. They're things that I hear about, one in business circles from other entrepreneurs, or things that I hear about in therapy with people. Talk with me about what that looks like as you're helping individuals with those concerns when you have your therapist hat on, and what does that look like when you have your coaching hat on?
Yeah, this is such an interesting question because I think that historically, a lot of times people try to draw these really rigid boundaries between coaching and therapy and suggest that, therapy looks only at the past and coaching looks only at the future. And I don't actually think that's true. That's not how it plays out in practice. And I think if you talk to most therapists and most coaches, they would say, yeah, no, we do a little bit of both. But because I think in either case, getting a little bit of an understanding of a why or of historical patterns is helpful to make changes. But I think the difference is that with therapy, we're maybe there's more of a meandering course, right? Like in therapy, we have time to open up, to explore all sorts of tangents, and to take kind of a winding road to get places. And not in that it's slow or distracted, but that we can get into all of the nuance of the why and what happened. And there's a lot of space to process that emotional weight. And so we are going to probably spend more time in the past for that reason, right? And making sure that feelings that were maybe stuffed down have space and airtime. And so in coaching, meanwhile, we still are going to look at those patterns and those whys, but we're going to move more quickly into insight. And then what do you want to do about it now? Right. So like, what's the step forward? And we may stay more focused on whatever brought them into coaching. Right. And so I also say that anything I do as a coach, I can actually do as a therapist, right? Therapy can use all that space. And because I have training in both, I do have therapy clients where I will talk about work concerns and, leadership skills. It's not, the reverse is not true, right? Everything that I do as a therapist, I'm not qualified,
Mm-hmm.
if you will, to do as a coach. And so there is also that difference.
Yeah. I'm wondering also, how do people in your coaching arena, how do they respond to also knowing about your background in mental health? I'm imagining that, I don't know, that people might be excited about that, but I'm just curious what reaction you've received from people who know that that's also part of your background.
I think for me, I see two different kind of categories of responses. One is, that's exactly why I sought you out. Like, I have,
Mm-hmm.
I am new to this leadership role, and I know that there's some stuff in my background that is impacting my skills as a leader, and I want a chance to work with that. And your background as a therapist is part of what's bringing me to you specifically. So there's
Mm-hmm.
definitely that camp. And then I have another camp that's kind of like, great, I don't really care, right? Like,
Uh-huh.
it's essentially saying, if that's helpful, if you bring in more, I think it's more of a like, great, you have that training in behavioral work and cognitive thought processes that I might not access with someone else as a coach, that they might not have. But also, I don't really care. Or I don't want, I have my own therapist. I don't want to do that here. I want some very clear lines. And that's great when that happens too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. So, talk with me. You talk about the ambitious identity paradox.
Yes.
For anyone who's like, what? What is that? I've never heard of that before. Talk with us about what that is.
Yeah, well, and they haven't heard about it before because it is my own kind of intellectual baby, if you will, that I've been starting to write on and mull on. I am in the process of working on a book on it, but it's basically the idea. It circles back to what I said is a common thing that people bring in, that question of, I've achieved this stuff and I'm not happy and I don't understand
Hmm.
why. And it's the idea that we're going after the wrong thing. It's not that
Hmm.
ambition is bad, right? That is not the message, but it is that the pursuit of external standards and a relentless drive for perfection end up sometimes overshadowing our true values and vision. And then that's what keeps you from achieving what you desire, right? So you go after kind of blind ambition, perfection, achievement, but they're based on other people's wants. And so the further you chase them, the more out of touch you get with yourself and the more unhappy you feel. Right. And I think, I do most of my work with women, and I think that's a particularly bigger problem for women because there are so many voices out there telling us how we should be and what we should do and how we should go after it. It's kind of constant external noise. And so you end up getting caught in this no-win situation, and it starts to feel very weighty, and you start to feel that sensation of nothing I ever do is enough. I can't be happy. I'm just overwhelmed. I'm drowning. And the solution is to take a pause, take a breath, and start to unpack those external standards, right? What am I chasing, and who told me to do that,
Hmm.
and why? And do I want any of that for real? And that process can be quick and easy, or it can be pretty lengthy depending on all sorts of individual variables. It's not like a one size fits all process. But getting really clear on kind of how do I shed some of this external stuff and then figure out what I want, what's in line with my values. What are those values, if maybe I've never even thought to ask that question? And then starting to practice making choices in that direction.
Yeah, so I'm wondering two things, but I'll go with the one question first, right? Like, concretely, can you give some examples of things that you see women chasing after? Like, society told me I should want X, Y, and Z things. I should strive for these things. And then maybe finding out, like, I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, I feel like I'm not meeting the standard. Like, what are some of those common things that you see women striving for that ultimately aren't bringing happiness or satisfaction?
This is a great question. And I feel like I want to put like an asterisk on my answer that says, you know, it could be anything. But, one is like we are so socialized to be people pleasers and to be good girls and to get the A plus, right? That a lot of women I see are just chasing like the next thing, the next rung on whatever career they're after. And at some point, it's just about getting the promotion and not about what you actually want to do. And I think in that case, it can feel kind of scary to look at it, because it's like, well, is what I really want to do like just, go live on an island and never work again? And maybe the answer is no. Maybe you do like your job, but we need to shift the kind of motivation in there, right? So that's definitely one. Like the achievement ladder is a common one. Another one that, even though it's going to sound superficial, I think it's so important, is the kind of domestic goddess, if you will, right? Like the clean and organized house, or the big house, or the well furnished and decorated house, right? Like if I get this right, it makes me a good mom, it makes me a good woman, it makes me a good spouse, right? We almost like equate, I think, domesticity with good womanhood, and they're not at all the same thing. I was just talking with a client recently, and it was like a light bulb went off when we talked about like, you don't have to have like matching guest towels in your like bathroom. That this is not a thing that actually matters in the grand scheme of the world. And it was like so much pressure lifted, because it wasn't, I mean, it's the towels, but it's the whole thing, right? It was emblematic of this much larger pressure. And she's like, look, I've got a kid, a 18-month-old, I'm pregnant, I've got a big job. And those are all really important to me. And actually this other stuff isn't. It's important to like my own mom. It's important to the, idea of what I'm supposed to want, but I actually couldn't care less. So I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah. And I love those phrases that you're using of, we've been taught to be good girls or a good woman. What is that? If you had to think of like a type, like what is that standard of the good girl or good woman that you think women have been sold on or brought up on?
I think there's certainly there should be a focus. It's kind of like the Barbie speech, right? Be pretty, but don't talk about trying to be pretty. Like, so there's an aesthetic, you have to appeal to a certain aesthetic standard, but don't actually voice that that's what you're doing. Be quiet, don't take up space, shrink your ambition, right? I think a lot of times we tell, especially working women and working mothers, to get small, right? If you're feeling overwhelmed, just don't work. As opposed to, if you're feeling overwhelmed, let's figure out what we can outsource, or can your spouse take on more, right? Can you take up more space instead and have that be the solution? And then I think there is this other, piece of stay in line, right? Don't get creative. Just stay kind of homogeneous to what everyone else is doing, particularly as a woman.
Yeah. Don't stand out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like a cookie cutter.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing you say is that there's a shift that happens when people go from pursuing something for the sake of pursuing it because someone told me it's worthy of being pursued, versus pursuing something because I, in fact, care about it.
Yeah.
That there's a shift in kind of how we feel about things when we're doing it for ourselves because of internal motivation versus this external motivation or desire to keep up with some standard.
Exactly. Right. That's what is the difference between, kind of unhealthy striving, perfectionism, blind ambition, and kind of truly aligned ambition for you and your needs, right? Is like, where is this coming from?